Good afternoon, everyone who is watching us on YouTube platform. Hi to my colleagues who is standing behind the camera and our guest. I'm very happy to open Ellex FinTech compliance session, which is composed of three parts. Session A, internal control, internal audit, and internal governance. Internal control from the business side, it definitely is seen as huge amount of costs. Meanwhile, compliance team cannot even imagine how highly regulated business could be operated without strong control systems and control measures. And the main pillar for internal control definitely is 3 lines of defense. I have no doubts that every one of you perfectly knows how these 3 lines of defense is defined. But when it comes to reality, and in different business models, what we've seen in our practice, that 3 lines of defense definitely has a lot of shades, a lot of colors, a lot of shapes, which needs to be adapted to each particular product, service, and business model in general. So, to start the session, I'm very happy to invite my colleague Yulia, who will give a brief but very practical overview of the 3 lines of defense. So, Yulia, most welcome.
Thank you, Yeva. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our sessions once again. And today I'm going to tell you about 3 lines model in practice and give you some practical insights how it could be organized. I believe everyone sometime in their career saw some kind of diagram like this one, or even like this one, or had some kind of magical or mythical words, you know. You have to have independent third line of defense. You have to have properly functioning second line of defense. Your second line of defense is not functioning properly. But what those magical words and diagrams means, what to do and how to become pro in internal control, and what to do in order you could claim, that you nailed 3 lines of defense model. So I'll try to put a little bit practice in theory and solve those riddles. And in order to do this, I'll, of course, start with a little bit theory. So what are those 3 lines model? I believe 3 lines of defense is more common term used in our financial market and some kind of even professional slang. And this model counts more than 20 years and is implemented in many financial market participants. This model is even a regulatory standard in the Republic of Lithuania and is required to be implemented by EMIs, PIs, and banks. As well, this model is reflected in EBA guidelines for internal control and governance. As well, it is implemented in many international soft law instruments. This model was recently upgraded, to be precise, in 2020, and as you can see, the word defense was deleted from this model. And this shift was made due to the purpose that organizations have to accept that they have not only to defend from the risks, but accept those risks and control those risks in order the company would be profitable and all those lines would create value for the organization. And this shift was also made in order to change the approach to the 3 lines as well. That 3 lines have to work not in silos, not separately from each other, but should cooperate and work hand in hand, achieving common goals of the organization. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that this model is not a set of rules, it's rather a set of principles, and as Yeva correctly emphasized, implementation of this model can vary organization from organization and even jurisdiction from jurisdictions. And you can, in practice, see many different forms of implementation that depends on the organization itself, its risk appetite, its products, its people we have on board. So let's go back to the diagram of a model. And as you know, this is the most recent representation of a freelance model itself. And what does it mean in reality? Let's decode it and change the view to the scheme that is more common to us, to the organizational chart of simple EMI. And for what freelance model tells us? That each organization should have stakeholders, governance bodies, that is board and supervisory board, and management. Stakeholders, when we are talking within the lines of the organization itself, it is the shareholders. As I mentioned, governance body means management board or supervisory board, but not every financial institution is obliged to compose a supervisory board within the organization. EMIs, in particular, EMIs and PIs. And management is CEO, deputy CEO, as well as the management of the first line and the second line. One might ask, third line is internal auditor, and one might ask why I have drawn two possible reporting lines, both to the shareholders and to the board or supervisory board. However, as you know, from the recent regulation of the Bank of Lithuania, AMI or PI can organize in structure and delegate supervisory function to the shareholders. So when I am drawing reporting line to the shareholders, I'm talking about shareholders acting in the supervisory function. Second line and second line managers are compliance officer, AML compliance officer, information security officer, risk officer, and data protection officer. And when we are talking about first line and first line management, those are both your front office and your back office. I will talk about each line and each of the positions separately. Despite the fact that stakeholders and governing bodies are not separated as a separate line in the model, they are definitely have important part within the organization, and without them, there would be no organization at all, and freelance model cannot function at all as well. So International Audit Association defines stakeholders as both groups and individuals whose interests are served or impacted by the organization. Governing body are those individuals who are accountable to stakeholders for the success of the organization. And management, meaning first line and second line, are those individuals, teams, and support functions assigned to provide products or services to organization clients and support governing body in the management of the risks and compliance within the company. What should be taken into account that the primary goal of every institution should be to ensure that its activities and objectives would be aligned with the interests of the stakeholders, meaning the shareholders. So the shareholders draws the direction of the organization itself and delegates overview rights to the governing body that those interests would be met. Governing body, meaning management board and supervisory board, are responsible for the creation of proper structure, establishment of that structure, delegation and division of functions within the organization, and of course, setting up risk appetite. The governing body defines vision, mission, values of the organization and delegates the task to achieve those goals to the first line and management along with the necessary resources. Management are the ones who are responsible for the implementation of organizational goals and ensuring the proper compliance and risk management within the organization. So you can see that the whole direction of the organization is drawn from the top to the bottom by separating functions, responsibilities between those roles, and creating subordination and control. First line. First line role is defined as provision of products and services to the clients and direct risk management within the organization. The first line are all units of the organization, as I said, both front office and bank office, meaning this is the customer support, customer onboarding, monitoring, and back office as well, such as IT support, legal, accounting, HR, meaning that those are all functions, all operational units that are needed in order the company could run properly. And the first line is the one who faces the risks firstly, and of course creates risks from their own activities. And it's not some kind of accusations, because it is definitely when you are providing services, when you are executing a particular function, when you are developing AT, handling claims, or onboarding customer, you are the one who can understand the environment of risks that surrounds the organization and helps to understand each organization what risks the organization faces. So this is the starting point from where all the risks should be started to identify, evaluated, and of course controlled. And the first line has to support second line in assessing those risks and creating proper compliance and risk management plans and programs, and to implement those plans. What is important here, that in order to achieve proper cultural and ethical environment, all processes, all procedures, all products should be correctly and fully described in the documents of the organization, in order the first line could understand their role, their responsibility, their liabilities, and how the process runs and what we have to do. Second important aspect, that first line should cover all operational units, all operations of a company, meaning that the governing body, management board, should consider what functions are needed that the company could run smoothly. I could hardly imagine any financial institution without customer support, legal department, accounting, customer onboarding, customer screening, IT development. So those are the main and first points that should be created within the organization. And there is no particular amount of people that should be established, particular amount of positions that should be established within the organization. There is no formula, and it really depends on the organization itself. As the company grows, geography expands, more customers are onboarded, the first line should grow with the company as well. Whether this line might be outsourced, yes, it is a possibility to outsource this function. However, what should be taken into account that outsourcing creates additional risks, meaning that you should set framework, guidelines, manuals for your third-party vendor that it could follow your internal ethical requirements, your internal procedures and processes to ensure that all risks are met, faced, and controlled properly. So what are the key to success? To have properly functioning first line, as I said, it is documentation, it is awareness in order that all your positions, all your employees would understand their role within the organization and their responsibility, training to raise their competence, and of course, delegation of sufficient resources. Second line are those individuals and independent advisors who have to continuously support governing bodies and first line in risk management, meaning monitoring, advice, guidance, testing, analyzing, and reporting on matters related to the management of risk and compliance. The main objective of this line is the compliance with laws, regulations, acceptable ethical behavior, internal control, information and technology security, and data protection. What should be found in every EMI, every PI, or a bank? A clear and separate functions of EML compliance officer, risk officer, data protection officer, and information security officer. Those are the main people who should compose your second line. Those people should be of proper qualification and sufficient seniority in order we could advise first line, we could provide advices to the management board, to the supervisory board, support first line, find deficiencies in the activities of a first line, create a remediation plan, and follow how those plans are implemented. And whether do you need a full set of second line within your organization? Definitely yes. This is a requirement of a regulation and expectations of your regulator. Should these functions be carried out by separate individuals? Probably yes. There is possibility to twin some of those functions. However, what should be taken into account that proper competences and sufficient time should be ensured. For example, one could combine compliance officer and data protection officer, but it would be hardly possible to find good compliance officer who should be expert in information security as well. Moreover, as I said, sufficient time should be delegated for the second line functions. Therefore, it is hardly possible that one person could cover all second line functions, meaning that one or several of them would be abandoned and not carried out at all. Can second line be merged with the first line? Maybe, but only if proper separation of functions is ensured, proper conflict of management of conflict of interest is ensured, and you should ensure that the one who executes functions in the first line is not allowed to control that function at the same time, meaning that your second line has to be independent. And then it comes to the outsourcing. Can you outsource second line functions? Part of those functions or even some of those functions in full could be outsourced. But what should be taken into account? For example, every fintech, most of the fintechs probably buys core banking solution together with the information security program coming with that core banking solution and believes that the information security function is properly covered within the organization. However, what is the reality? Whether that core banking solution is the only system the company uses in its activities. How about accounting? How about reporting? How about internal communication? How about screening, monitoring, onboarding? How about all those systems? And how about hardware, password security, physical security? I don't think that core banking service provider with a proper internal information security program ensures that all information security aspects are fully covered within the organization. And when it comes to the compliance outsourcing, it is the same. You should know what kind of services you are buying, because compliance functions should be implemented within the organization continuously and without any interruptions. Compliance functions should communicate with the first line, should communicate with the governance body, and should understand activities of a company, its products, its risks. So if your vendor provides you services and advices only then, and if you call or implement some kind of compliance check according to a separate order, I would say, that you don't have properly functioning second line of defense in your company at all. And what about third line? As I said, it is an internal audit, and I would say it is one of the most forgotten lines within the organization and usually might be mistaken with a compliance function. We will have a separate session next week, session B, that will be dedicated particularly to internal audit. But today I will just briefly describe several aspects of third line function. First of all, the same as for the second line, this function should be fully established within the organization and should involve not only carrying out particular audits, but setting up internal audit plan that is based on the risks the company faces, meaning that the most risky parts of the organization should be audited more frequently. And third line also never, ever can be twinned with the second line of the first line, because first line function covers all the organization, all activities of the organization, and should help governance bodies to understand how the organization is controlled and where it is going. So if you think that you have third line fully covered by a third-party vendor that just provides you separate audits according to the separate orders, it would be the same as for the outsource of a compliance function. That third-party vendor would not understand what your company is doing, would not communicate with your first line and second line, and would run internal audit checks according to a separate audits, and it would not be continuous function of a company. And instead of conclusions, why exactly do you need to organize your organization in three lines model? Why someone should rack one's brain about it? So first of all, three lines model helps to properly distribute functions within the organization. Avoid the duplication of functions and gaps in your internal control. Three lines model also ensure that the one who executes the function is not the one who also controls that function, and as well ensures that the independent advice to the governing body is provided. Financial institutions are not and cannot be one-man show. You cannot sing, dance, play music at the same time, sell tickets, check them, ensure controllability, and clean the stage after the show, and to expect to be profitable and world-known brand. It needs a proper set of organization and hand-in-hand teamwork in order to grow to the world-known brand and be highly regarded by the customers, regulators, and partners. And only proper distribution of functions helps to understand where your organization is going and what kind of risk it faces and what regulatory environments where the organization acts is. No one says that from the day one, organization should start with 50 people on board. You can start with a very compact and universal team, but as the scope of the products grow, geography expands, and customers chooses to use your services, the structure of the organization should become more complex, sophisticated, and specialized. So in a perfect world, perhaps only one line of defense would be needed to assure effective risk management. In the real world, however, a single line of defense is inadequate and creates a lot of possibilities for risk to materialize. So thank you. And do we have questions? And as I see, we don't have questions for this part. So I would like to welcome our panelists today for today's discussions. This is Dovilė Arlauskaitė from Bank of Lithuania, Vytautas Danta from Revolut, Kazimieras Zaveckas from Swedbank, and Eglė Kontautaitė from Ellex. I'm happy to have you all here today. So, as it was already overviewed in the presentation, freelance models requires particular functions and lines to be set up in the organization. However, there is no one-size-fits-all or certain set of rules how the organizational structure should look like, or how properly to twin or distribute functions within the second line or between the first line and second line. However, I believe we have some kind of basic principles to follow and expectations from a regulator. So, Dovilė, what is the regulator's approach? How many FTEs and different functions fintech should have? What functions are essential within the organization? And what about the first line? When it should be established and whether it should be established at all?
So, as you mentioned in your presentation, actually, there was, very good remarks for that, but we have the principles how to manage such a system, what are the free lines, what mean each line in organization, but however, we do not have the one answer which fits for all companies, or we do not have the magic answer which really work in practice for all the EMIs or PIs. As a regulator, we understand the complexity. On the other hand, as I mentioned, there cannot be the specific answer for all the companies. So we are really working with communication with supervising market participants, explaining our expectations, how we as a regulator understand what are the expectations towards the companies, how we need to deal with such principles. Also in our expectation letter, we expressed that there are at least 4 functions as a must to have in the companies from the very beginning. It is a country manager or a manager residing in Lithuania permanently, compliance officer, AML officer, and information security officer. So then I'm talking about these 4 functions. I'm talking about the function, not the FTEs, because also it depends on the business model, on the size of the business, on the operations, how many FTIs do you need to have, particular in your case.
And what about first line? Whether organization should have it and when it should have it?
Of course, it should have. And here maybe I want to notice that this 3 lines model, it's not just because it's nice to have. All the lines really have the function and the intention why this line we need to have in the company. So first line, also as you mentioned in your presentation, is this one which have direct contact with clients usually. They have a direct contact in provision of financial services. So of course they need to the company need to have this line also from the very beginning. And what we see from the regulatory perspective, that we cannot talk only about having these functions, even all the 3 functions that you need to have only then you start the operations. Actually, you need to have that from very beginning because it helps for the companies to prepare for the practical implementation, because no one knows better what you are doing, what are the risks, and how to mitigate these risks, if not you.
Of course. Vytautas, as you know, Revolut as fintech unicorn, of course, you know, second line of defense, I believe, is of major importance for the activities of Revolut. What is your opinion? How to ensure properly functioning second line within the organization, and how many people do you actually need?
Hello, everyone. It's not so easy answer for your question, and just to reflect what my colleague has mentioned, that in different organizations, I guess they would find different ways how to find the best way how to implement second line of defense function, how it will interact with the first line and third line of defense. Regarding resources, also it depends on on the size of operations and the scope of services. I mean, how much products you're offering to your clients and so on. What are your jurisdictions? So are you operating in one country, or maybe you're operating in many countries? That's why you need more people located in all these countries. But what would be my point, and yes, I agree and we have regulations in place which says that what functions do we need to have, but I really believe in synergy and cooperation between functions. So in my view, it should be also, if organization mature enough, it should be seeking for as much as consolidated second line, because there are a lot of synergy there between compliance officer and MLRO. So there are a lot of ways how to achieve common goals much better than being separate. But of course, these 2 functions are separate. But of course, on top there is a room for having a consolidated view on that.
Kazimieras, as very experienced compliance officer, could you just elaborate more about compliance officer's role within the organization, and what is compliance officer, whether the organization needs that functions at all, and does properly documented processes means that your compliance function is also works properly?
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here, and appreciated that you're organizing such event, and we have possibility and floor to share our experiences. You just raised several questions, and I'll start from the first one. Before, my colleagues just shared thoughts how compliance function should be organized, how many FTEs we need in order to start compliance function. I think, first of all, we should start not from the numbers, but from the culture. One thing is that you have a regulation which requires to set up a compliance function, and definitely you could implement, and probably all entities, regulated entities, implement this, but there is like a soft aspect, which I think for compliant day-to-day activities maybe much more important than just to be compliant with regulatory requirements. It's compliance culture and ethics. So it's some kind of like a tone at the top, which our organization really sends to the rest of employees, to the team. How do they perceive compliance? And then we could go to the compliance definition. What does compliance mean for organization? Is it really just to establish some kind of framework or organizational unit which is required by regulators? Just take and implement this, or it's something more? Do we see additional value into aspect that we have such organization? And I would say then, for instance, new organizations starts the activity and like to set up compliance function. It should come, as I said, from the top. It's a tone at the top, and it's not about compliance, but about values and ethics, first of all. And only probably the next steps is how particular organization implements specific setup. And as Vito shared, it depends on your organization, on your products which you offer in the market. So it could vary from several numbers. So then probably having ethics and standards in place, you could define what exactly definition is for compliance for a particular organization, and based on this, you could build up and in order to have a well-functioning compliance organization, you need to set up clear links, not only with the top management, but as Guido has mentioned, the rest of organization, and moreover, it's like a contact link between organization and supervisors. So compliance, one part of the job is really to ensure compliance with existing regulations, internal, external, but another important thing is really to relies on relationship with the regulators, and it's super important to handle it properly. And I think this could be as well initial standing point when you are starting to build up organization, that the top management provides sufficient mandate to compliance. Do we have a trust in compliance, and do we believe that we could create additional value, not like selling additional products within the market, but really safeguarding top management, other employees, and rest of organization from any adverse events, incidents, issues, adverse media coverages, or even pecuniary fines.
Thank you, Kazimieras. And Egle, updated freelance models changed approach, how a certain lines should act, and involved a need, to cooperate for lines to cooperate? And pursuant to upgraded models, what are the touching points between the lines and how should we work together? And what is important of each lines and how we bring value to the organization?
So actually, I sympathize for everyone who just expressed their opinion. I was waiting to having a hot argument somewhere here, but maybe I can state my first initial feelings. I became aware of 3 lines of defense, a model, I think it was around 10 years ago. And on the paper, it looked very nice. It was like a box when you see how risk comes from the one end, and there are 3 layers, and then the smaller hole that goes to the smaller risk from the other hand, and there's a top of management on the top of the box, or a triangle showing how the process owners that own risk, and then risk becomes smaller going through the second line, which is expertise and consultancy for the first line, giving them support, and then of course independent audit, giving assurance that control is effective. And I had the privilege actually to look at how these defense models worked in practice. And yet again, on the paper, in the organizational structure, it looked quite nice. And everyone was seeking how to put those fences, those defenses, those walls, and how to work in order to minimize the risk. And somehow, during those 10 years in MLCFT area, there were a few major collapses in the area of risk management. Which yet again, I will not talk about that, no worries here. So it's only lessons to be learned for now. But it already gives and raises some questions why it didn't work. And I suppose that the answer lies in a very nice paper that Internal Institute of Internal Auditors issued quite recently. It's 2020, and I suggest for everyone to read it. It's quite reader-friendly. It's short and quite nicely structured, and it doesn't matter if you're in IT risk management or AML, CFT, or compliance. What it reminds and what is lost, what was lost in between, and Kazimieras just recently mentioned, is the value. Each and every organization their objective is to create value. And each and every line, and actually what the Institute for Internal Auditors has done, it intentionally striped out the defense, the terminology of defense. It's not here, it's 3 lines model. So each and every line, while managing risk, it has to be reminded that it creates value, it defends the value. And the value is a very quite broad term, and the risk is an unavoidable part of that value. And when there is another thing, what Internal Institute of Auditors says, that it's very important, and again I sympathize with Vytautas said, and Kazimieras, and I think Dovile also mentioned, communication, cooperation, collaboration. And it's not the different line, it's not about organizational structure, it's about roles and responsibilities. Each and every line has its role and responsibility. And it's not like they are acting separately, like first line takes the risk, second line's minimizing risk, third line ensuring that it's only like that left of the risk. But they all work all together, concurrently, parallelly. Meaning that, and communication is a necessary part. Who else than the first line, the process owners, knows better about the product and the customer? It's only then that who is aware what is the purpose and intention of business relationship. However, the second line has expertise where the risk lies. And the communication between those lines is a necessary factor for properly working of those lines. When you're trying to build walls between those lines, and I don't mean that segregation of duties, it should be here, of course it should be here, and the control function has a control function, the business function is responsible for the business part, but this business part should be aware that there is some kind of risk lying here, and there is a deep knowledge in the second line that the business should consult if the risk is acceptable. So the main touching point, what I think the new model says, it's not fences, it's not the walls, although segregation administrators must be here, but it's rather communication, exchange of information, support for each other, and seeking the value. Risk is part of the value, and defending a value is a part of either its business or its risk management. Everyone, each line together, has to protect it.
Yes, of course.
May I reflect what Agla said? I really support that you said. Unfortunately, I haven't read this paper. Then you explain what's been written. I just imagine a picture where like organization is a big boat and second line sits in a separate one and just doing inspection and control how this big boat look like and what are kinds of risk the big boat is exposed to. So what Agla said, that risk being a second line of control and compliance as well sits on the same boat. So if something wrong with the main boat, so something wrong with compliance as well. It's not with the business, it's not with compliance, but we are one team and we are working together. So probably this is like a main idea from this auditor's paper. And yeah, I'm sharing with you completely.
Thank you, Kazimieras. And Davile, many startups and young fintechs struggle when we have to form full second line, you know, as you mentioned, to have compliance officer, money laundering reporting officer, we need risk officer as well. And is there any possibilities to twin those functions, you know? What are the criteria to twin those functions, and how many functions and responsibilities one person could bear?
Again, there is no one clear answer for that. What is the most important, you know, to have not just in paper or formally all these 3 lines, or as you asked, the second line, to have some positions, and that would be enough for the companies. What is the main goal, you know, to have efficiently working second line of defense. And for here also we need to talk about the competence of the person or the people who are working in this line. This is the answer: how many functions one person can have in his or her hands. It depends on the personality, on the experience, on the qualification, at least. What is the knowledge of the sector? What is the knowledge of the risks? Sometimes, unfortunately, in practice, we see the situations when companies have not the minimum stuff in the second line, but still this line do not work in proper way. So first thing is, you know, to ensure that it works in reality. Yes, we can sometimes merge some functions or to provide few functions for one person, but also here we need to think how it would work in practice. Do we have any conflicts of interest? For example, if I am responsible for the doing business, if my responsibility is to think how to do that broadly, so I cannot by the same time be responsible for the risk mitigation, because by itself there is the conflict from my interest, and actually in practice it would be, I believe, it is not a situation that I can, you know, just switch as a robot from one function to another. Of course, some functions we can do, as I mentioned, but also we need to take into account how many working hours we all have, and whether it is possible for us to mitigate or to take over all these functions.
And Vytautas, you just mentioned that every organization should have compliance officer and EML compliance officer. Could you elaborate more whether we can be as one function, or it would be better to distribute those functions to separate people?
Yeah, so as Dovile mentioned, so we always need to evaluate whether we have good candidates on board which can cover maybe few functions and they can lead both teams. Yes, so this is very important. So competencies are very important here, and of course necessary resources to support all that. But these two functions as regulatory compliance and Malraux, definitely they are working with the different tasks, but there is a room for synergy. So let's say both of them, they need to understand the laws and regulations they need to implement, and both of them, they need to provide reports to senior management. Why shouldn't they cooperate? And I mean, to provide one consolidated report to the management board, to council, if council is established. So that would bring better value for the internal stakeholders and even to external stakeholders, because it will be more holistic view on that situation. I would also like to reflect a little bit on these competences, and I believe that currently what we see in the market, that we have more and more market participants, and there is a huge demand of compliance officers, of Malraux, and what is happening in the market, that I see a need that, and I hope this will happen in the nearest future, that we will establish some kind of benchmark. What is minimum standard for you to be like Malraux, a compliance officer, or whatever board member is responsible for AML? Currently, we see already that the regulators are asking these questions: how you can prove that he has or she has good knowledge in that area. But I hope that maybe in the future we will be seeking for more clear, benchmarks there. And I also would like to reflect a little bit to previous comments from my colleagues regarding tone from the top. What is very important in my view is risk appetite. And that we're already starting to discuss in various organizations, that culture is very important. This is how we will, what we're aiming for, but to set clear risk appetite, this is very important. And some years back, everybody was saying, I want to be compliant with the laws and regulations, but what does it mean? How to measure that? It's impossible to measure if you just say like this. If you want to set tone from the top, you need to say what kind of clients I would like to have, where is these jurisdictions where I will be operating, what kind of products I will be offering. Then it will be even easier than to, these are like my red lines, yes, which I am following, and then for the rest of the organization, for second line, for third line, even for first line, would be easier to talk to each other because they are going to the same direction.
Yes, sure, Vytautas, thank you. And Kazimieras, maybe you could also reflect about compliance and AML compliance functions, and should we be merged or should we be separate functions?
I would tend to agree what's been said already, and it depends on a specific organization, on its size, on its, as Vytautas mentioned, risk appetite, on a range of products which company offers to the clients, and probably no one recipe I could say, and this could go as a natural development. And as Vytautas mentioned, just to have effective compliance or risk organization, you need, first of all, to have as well risk appetite predefined, and this is like a really trendy thing now. Then risk organizations together with first line, working together on risk appetite, KPIs for specific areas. These kind of things are easy traceable and measurable, so this helps really to plan effectively resources both on first line and second line. I wouldn't distinguish second line as one as separate second line and just focus how many compliance employees or risk employees organizations should employ. But it should go together with the first line, and it depends which part of organization has chosen how strong is the first line. What are like a cooperation between first and second line? Definitely, it should be on the best possible level. But when we're talking about new organizations or would like to enter new business areas, new products, it could be the situations where, like, you could step into like a gray area where lack of like expertise, historical data, statistics. And it's hard from like first step, very beginning, to define clearly what would be impact on your daily business. So I would say step by step, but conceptually, I think colleagues here already expressed what is needed really: culture, risk appetite, key rise, close cooperation.
Thank you, Kazimieras. And Egle, EBA recently published draft guidelines with regards to EML compliance officers. So what do those guidelines says about possibility maybe to merge or divide functions of EML and general compliance?
Yeah, so regarding merging or dividing those functions. So yet again, I like to start from Adam and Eve. If Institute of Internal Auditors, it sets main principles. So, of course, consequently, other institutions, they say more specifically what is expected. So these draft guidelines, what's interesting in them, they talk not only about MLCFT compliance function, but also about responsibilities of the management body performing supervisory functions or managing functions, and also about how this MLCFT role communicates and correlates with other functions. What it says that MLCFT compliance function might be merged with other functions. And yet again, it doesn't talk about organizational structure. It's only about roles, responsibilities, and accountability. What it specifically mentions that interest of conflicts must be avoided, and of course, the MLCFT compliance officer or role or function should not be responsible for controlling, should not be subordinated to the function which is for which control is responsible. So not business and first line and second line merged altogether. There must be some segregation of duties. What it also says, when deciding if it should be a separate role or if it could be merged, not only size plays its role, but also complexity of the institution, meaning what products does it offer, and what geographies does it service. And I think there is a logical explanation of that. The more complex, the more complicated, the more riskier your business model is, the more competencies you have to have in the specific area. So you have to pay attention when you are willing to merge those functions or to make those functions separate. What it also says, and it's quite interesting, compliance function and MLCFT function might go leg in leg or hand in hand altogether in one role or one function. But yet again, it depends on the specific business model.
And Angela, you mentioned, that MLRO should not report directly to the business line. And what is your opinion? Whether it should be better that MLRO would report directly to the board, or can the reporting line to CEO go as well?
What the guidelines mention specifically, it's ML board member. And one aspect I would like to mention that, well, it's not MLRO, it's money laundering reporting. Reporting is also part of that function, but it's much broader, not only the reporting function. What it mentions that the MLCFT role performs only advisory function while onboarding customers. It always the responsibility lies within the management. And the communication with the management goes through the AML board member. And there are quite a broad responsibilities described in those guidelines for AML board member.
Thank you. And Kazimieras, what do you need to do in order to have strong compliance function within the organization? And what you started, telling us about the relationship compliance officer should have with the management or with the regulator. So could you elaborate a little bit more about it?
Good question, really. First of all, top management should enjoy that we would like. First of all, we should enjoy to have compliance function and see added value in having this compliance function. And then some things already been mentioned here, like expertise. It's super important. Yeah, without knowledge and expertise, you would not have possibility to build up something strong and what really would protect you from any unexpected events. Then I'd like to return back to the culture thing. This is like a value thing. And as well, probably persons who taking such role should be matured as well, because it's not that you are working with black and white. And then compliance faces challenges, faces like a gray area. Then there is like situations where you have incidents and you have to have communication with your top management and what to do with your regulators. Should I go to the top management and say it in transparent way that we have an issue? What would be the consequences? And at the same time, I should liaise this relationship with the regulator, speaking in the same transparent mode, the regulator just being able to express. And this shows for me some kind of maturity, both in person and from professional side. So this would be probably as well success factor, just to then organization would like to build up a strong compliance function. Agla mentioned cooperation. I can't imagine that organization would have a strong compliance function without cooperation between first, second, and third line, and then you need to like make a blurry of these lines and not to separate, saying, oh, I'm sitting on a second line of defense and then enjoy some kind of powers and mandates authority on others, and this wouldn't play. Because risks are coming from the first line. They are like a first instance where we meet clients, we're introducing new products, we're running some kind of operations, and without good cooperation and an understanding, you would never ever achieve efficiency. Perception of compliance. As well, another important aspect, if organization would see compliance as some kind of policeman, controller, you could imagine if like you're driving a car, overspeeded, and you've been stopped by a policeman, you always like feel nervous, what will happen, okay, I'll have to pay fine. If you just receive advice from your like person who just wanted to safeguard you, just to warn you, look, what are kind of road conditions, please drive safely, you would be like surprised, wow, it's something amazing. And I would say something similar should apply organization in daily work in communication and in organizing setup like compliance and the rest of organization. And yeah, and probably as well, as I said, contact with the regulators. Just giving example, it should be transparent, but probably it's not enough. You always have to be on the top what is what is cooking around and be able really to be one step ahead. We mainly facing already facts which already has happened. We're using for our risk models information which happened in the past. We are making our assessments based on our previous knowledge. We applying regulations which been enacted some time already ago. But for compliance, I would say it's more probably additional burden just to be some kind of fortune teller, just to see what's next around the corner. And if a compliance is so experienced, no one from like ordinary people could do this, but just to have some kind of like a sixth feeling and be able really to predict what's next, what's happened next, what kind of risks our organization could be exposed in next like half a year, 1 year, 2 years. It's really helpful for the management, for the first line, and all organization, because then it means that you are not really working with the past possible events and risks. You as well doing something in order to prevent and to limit potential exposure to the risks which you still don't know or which haven't showed up yet.
Thank you. We discussed, that compliance officer second line should communicate and then cooperate with governance, but with management board. And how about if compliance officer or AML compliance officer would be incorporated and appointed as a member of the board? Whether it would help organization or not?
Yeah, so I guess some years back it was natural that at least one board member would be like responsible for risks, and that was like it evolved. Now we already see that not only risk as a function, like a second line function, is present in the management boards, but we also have organizations which also appoints heads of compliance to the board, and for me it makes sense because. If we say that these functions are important for the organization, we need to make sure that they are represented in the management bodies and that they have opportunities to do influence on decisions which are related with the risk. And also talking about this, it's also natural because there are also requirements to appoint a board member responsible for AML, let's say, yes, so who should be that? Still, I believe there are organizations which are appointing CEO responsible for AML, but in my view, it is more efficient because then you are not mixing like first line and second line. It's natural, yes, because then you have a board member who is responsible also for second line of defense of function. So that would create additional value. Yeah, definitely.
And Kazimieros, what is your opinion?
Sharing the same view, just wanted to say it shows as well some kind of maturity of organization. It's another word which would clearly describes the situation, and we have compliance or risk in the board, would be like a trust from shareholders and as well probably a direction sign. There are some risks as well having compliance or risk on the board, because board is like executive body, and we're taking not only risk-related decisions, but as well we're taking day-to-day business-related decisions, and then you have such kind of setup. You need really to think around already how you're going to manage your potential conflict of interest, how you're going to log these, but overall opinion is that this is new and trendy thing. Helps really for compliance to speak up already at the board level without any obstacles, without any intermediaries, bring up issues, bring up any topics and questions, and being as well part of a management is like some kind of assessment for compliance that we're expecting from shareholders and management to bring up culture to the rest of the team.
And what would be regulators? Oh, yes, we do that.
Just just wanted to complement what Kazimieras has mentioned. So also being in the management board, what that adds to second line is engagement as well, because we just talked about cooperation and that we cannot work in silos. Yes, first line, second line, third line. So it could be examples when second line is always telling, it's not my responsibility, it's your responsibility. It's very comfortable to be in that position, just to say no, and to say like whatever, this is your call, not mine. And being in the management board, being more engaged, just brings additional value to the organization, because then again, all functions they understand the same goal. They are taking decisions and they are cooperating better, because then you all accountable for what you're doing. Yeah.
And what is regulator's approach? Do you see that trend, and would you support inclusion of second-line officers in the board?
Actually, as we already discussed, and I believe that we all agree on that, but yes, we need to have 3 lines of defense. By the same time, we need to ensure the communication between all these 3 lines, all the functions. And actually, we have not a separate functions, but we have a unit, the company as a unit. All the functions work to ensure that the business is successful in the broad meaning. And compliance is one of this meaning. Of course, we need to ensure that company operates in compliant manner, in mature manner. So first of all, the company knows the best, I would say, how to ensure the effective communication between these 3 lines or the second line and the management board, how to avoid the possible conflict of interest, and if all the principles are respected and fulfilled, which we already discussed for a while. So we do not see any negative answers for such solutions.
Thank you, Devila. And since we're running out of time, I just wanted for you all for one takeaway, one key takeaway, one recommendation to the market participants from a regulator.
So my recommendation would be, as also we already discussed, to see the value of compliance, to see the value of this structure of 3 lines defense, and actually to think not only how to fulfill the formal requirements or fulfill the principle, the implementation, but how to do and ensure that this structure works in reality, works well, and also to be flexible, to take into account how your business changes, how many clients do you have, how many services do you provide for your clients, in which jurisdictions, what is the geography of your business. And this is not, that you sit one day, create the structure, and you are happy next 10 years. So please remember that every day that you need to be flexible and adopt your structure in order to fulfill it works in practice.
Thank you, Devila. And Vytautas, what would be your recommendation?
Just to add what Devila has mentioned, so I would recommend and advise to agree on as much as highest level in this organization, to agree on red lines. So what is acceptable, where you want to be, what are your success criteria, and not just to have like in a very, very generic way, but very concrete, and then to agree how you will measure that. And then I guess would be more successful, I guess, journey going further.
Kazimieras.
many things being said here, really good things, and I'm trying really now summarize in my head all these tips and hints how to make compliance organization more matured. I'm in agreement with other speakers, and just in order to show additional value, my advice would be more proactive and be more like future-oriented. And with this, you would show that compliance is a real safeguard for organization. And this is like a recipe building trust, confidence, and as well all organization would respect that compliance safeguarded or removed risky situations and obstacles. Thanks.
And Agla?
So we're lacking time. So, not to repeat, but I cannot imagine how to not to repeat. For business, it's just to know that you have a support. You have a support of knowledge, of competences, which altogether with you creates a value. For compliance, remember that you also have to create a value. And drawing red lines and risk appetite, stating only how to avoid risk, is not the same as managing risks. Maybe some creation of value might be found while seeking the balance. So listen to the business as well.
Thank you, Agla. Do we have questions? We have several questions from the audience. Could you please provide an example how roles of compliance officer and MLO differs in practice? Yes, the same theme we just discussed, but maybe Vytautas, could you elaborate a little bit how those roles differs?
First of all, of course, it's all about risk taxonomy, I guess, where you can start, because you agree that Malraux is responsible for fin crime risks. So let's say compliance is responsible for consumer protection, for, so that's how you can define. And of course, then you go through the roles and responsibilities, because like Malraux, they usually also, they report to financial intelligence, which normally compliance, they are not doing that. So yeah, so that's how you can define risk taxonomy, like lists of risks and who is responsible for controlling that specific risk.
So thank you all. Thank you for coming today, joining us. It was a really nice discussion. And we'll meet in 10 minutes, 10 minutes break. So welcome back to the second part of our session. And really important part of internal control is understanding what kind of relationships you're entering with your partners or service providers. So good practical presentation from our senior consultant from Ellex, Mindaugas Maskalionis.
Outsourcing, agency, correspondence. We all know these words. We use them every day in our business activities. But do we always realize what does it mean in practice? How they differ, how we apply them within the organization. So this is what I will tell you today. Hello, my name is Mindaugas Maskalionis, as Julia mentioned. I will share with you most common forms of relationship in fintech sector and regulatory landscape around them, and most importantly, how to qualify those relationships in practice. I will not dive deep into controls or risk management measures. This will be covered by the panel discussion, but I will explain the model and the qualification. So, the fintech sector can be described as a business based on innovative solutions and user-friendly products. However, in order to offer this, most financial institutions are looking for the quick solutions to meet the growing needs of their customers. It is no secret that in fintech sector is finding ways to meet these needs, but at what price? There are so many different service providers available to assist in provision of the services of the fintech sector. Partners are used to expand the scope of services that are not available under the existing license, or even offering third-party services in combination with the company's services. Sometimes partners are a good way to reach new markets or new customer segments. But what we need to keep in mind, fintech sector is heavily regulated industry. So this means that entering into any relationship with the counterparties, financial institutions must clearly identify the relationship between them and decide on the appropriate requirements, controls, and measures. So in order to, apologies for not showing the slides. Yeah, so we are here. So in order to discuss the three models, so I'll discuss about the three forms: agency distribution model, outsourcing arrangements, and of course, correspondent relationship. Let's start with the agency and distribution model. An agent, by the definition, is a person who acts on behalf of EMI or PI, where in the providing payment services. On the other hand, distributors are not explicitly defined in EU or Lithuanian laws. Yet, we can find that distributor refers to any person entitled to carry out distribution or redemption of e-money on behalf of authorized EMI. Agent and distributor, both of them, in terms of payment services, are not independently acting entities. Both agent and distributor, while providing payment services, issuing or redeeming e-money, are acting on behalf and following strict instructions of the EMI or PI, respectively. Also, it is very important to note that clients onboarded through the agent or distributor are considered to be the clients of the licensed EMI or PI. When we know that the relationship may be qualified as agency, we understand that certain regulatory requirements will need to be met, such as carrying due diligence, notifying the ball, and implementing internal control or risk management measures towards agents' activities. Outsourcing. It is particularly important form of partner relationship that you'll probably find in all the fintech sector. Definition could be made up of basically two parts. This is an arrangement of any form between the licensed institution and the service provider. And the second part is this service provider performs function of the licensed institution. In other words, a service provider is considered as basically commercial partner of the financial institution and provides functions that are basically could be provided or implemented by the institution itself. These partners does not directly contract with the clients and do not provide services to them. What else is important? We need to identify functions that would be considered critical or important. This is also known as a significant outsource. In practice, these functions are those without which the provision of financial services would not be possible. Usually, technology-related services such as core banking system, monitoring tools, remote identification, sanction screening, and so on. And what is important to know? Every financial institution must assess the risk and carry out the due diligence of the partner. In case of significant outsource, a notification along with the draft agreement must be provided to the Bank of Lithuania. And of course, there need to be implemented internal control and risk management measures. Finally, one of my favorite forms of relationship is correspondent banking. Today I will talk only about the regular and most widely known model, like a relationship between the regulated financial institution, correspondent, which provides its usual services to the other financial institution, respondent. In addition to traditional treasury services, correspondent relations can include payment services, cross-border payments, currency exchange, and etc. So, by large, the aim of the correspondent relationship is to extend the scope of services of the respondent institution by the correspondent institution. But what are the main qualifying features? I would say that there are three main elements. Both institutions must be licensed. They do not have direct engagement with the respondent clients, and financial institution provides services under its own license. From the requirements and controls perspective, we also need to implement relevant internal control and risk management measures. What is important in addition to these requirements is that the respondent institution should abide by the correspondence instructions and risk appetite. So basically, we discussed the three most common partnership forms in the market, and now let's compare them to each other and discuss what the main distinguishing features are. With the scope of this presentation, we would like to highlight the four features that possibly most significantly reflect those differences. So, The first one is the license. Every financial service provider should think first about the license we need. Agents are not required to have the license. Obviously, in the case of the outsourcing, the license is also not required. However, for the correspondent relations to exist, both parties of the relationship must be licensed financial institutions. In case of relationship with the client or end user, agents have a direct business relationship with the customer because we are direct channel that reaches them. In the case of outsourcing, there is no business relationship with the end users. And in case of regular correspondent relationship, there are no direct relationship with the end users as well. Third feature is recipient of the services of the partner. So what are the services one party provides to other? In case of agency, it is simple intermediation. They cannot provide any independent financial services under this relationship. In case of outsourcing, recipient of outsourced services is a financial institution, those services are outsourced. And recipient of the correspondent banking services is a respondent financial institution. This means that agents directly serve the end users, while the other two cases, the recipient of the services is the financial institution itself. And the fourth one is a services to be provided or qualification of the service. So basically, in case of agency, it is simple intermediation. In case of outsourcing, it could be any function that would be performed by the service recipient. And in case of correspondent relationship, various financial services could be provided under their own license. So these are four main features in my view, but while determining the nature of the relationship between the parties, it should also be taken into account that relationship between the parties can have dual nature. For example, outsourcing and correspondent relationship. One licensed institution could provide outsourced technology-related services, not the financial ones, to our financial institution, and that would be considered outsourcing. But at the same time, processing of payments for our financial institution could fall under the definition of the correspondent banking relationship. So, in conclusion, I would like to take two important messages for you. First, there are several different regulatory regimes. Therefore, it is important to correctly identify the relationship before entering into an agreement. And the second one is the fintech sector often has unique solutions and products that sometimes go beyond a single regulatory regime. So each case should be assessed on an individual basis, and each time a new partnership is established or a new product is under development. So I wish all of you to continue to develop your amazing products and be one step ahead always. Thank you.
Thank you, Mindaugas, for good practical presentation. And I would like to continue to our second panel discussion, where we will discuss, how qualification of a relationship with a partners impacts internal control measures you should take. So please welcome to the stage our Ellex Dream Team, Ieva Dasinaitė, Giedrius Stasevičius, Gita Maleckaitė, and we have Neringa Mickevičiūtė online.
Ready? Mic is working. Okay, so dear guests, dear participants of our event, this discussion is dedicated to qualification of relationship between a financial institution and its partner. Why does it matter? In the regulated world of financial institutions, things not always are what they look like from the first glance. And in general, every financial institution at some point in time enters into relationship with a partner, vendor, in the context of offering its services to clients or organization of internal processes. And this relationship has consequences. Depending on the legal qualification, different rules and regulations apply. And this qualification does not always match the heading in which the parties have put on the top of their agreement. Substance will prevail over form in the eyes of the regulator. So more or less, those are the issues we would like to address in our panel discussion. And I would like to start with a few questions to Eva first, maybe? Yeah. So, Eva, is it correct to state that the same commercial result may be achieved through differently qualified relationship?
Definitely, actually, and this is the usual case, which misleads majority of the clients and the financial institutions by trying to understand the product or the service, by assessing it or by default applying one method to identify what is the particular relationship between the financial institution and the third party. So typical example can be a collaboration between two financial institutions, which can be actually qualified as outsourcing relationship. It can be qualified as agency or distributor relationship, or it can be correspondent banking relationship. And all three sort of methods or types of relations brings totally different duties from all internal control measures and systems perspective, and may result in different consequences from regulatory side. Meanwhile, from the commercial side, the product will be one and the same. So that's why it is crucial actually to do that qualification and to understand what the relation with a third party is, not only when you start negotiating with a third party, but once you start designing your product, your business, or maybe building up your financial model based on that particular product or service. So that's crucial because it might change completely the figures in terms of income, in terms of costs, because it might require different technology solutions. It might require different compliance duties and obligations to implement, which means, again, the costs, not only in technology, but also in human resources. And it might change totally the full sort of initial understanding of your business model, how it should work in the future. So that's why this is crucial to start or to to scrutinize these relations, especially related with the products and service to be offered to your customers at the very, very early stage.
So actually that was the question I wanted to ask. At what stage financial institution should qualify its relationship? So early stage, that would be the answer.
Exactly.
As early as possible.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. Especially, as I said, if it is related to the product or the service. And also, everyone should remember that we all the time have the possibility to apply to the regulator for the confirmation whether our certain qualification of a relationship is right and sort of fits to the requirements. Why it's necessary? Because the regulator, during the licensing stage, they're not qualifying the relations by itself, but they're relying on your own qualification. But when the operation starts and you get the license and you start providing the services, so everything might result in very messy sort of compliance slash business slash commercial sort of gumbo, which needs to be understood from the early stage, and then the regulator already might raise some questions and doubts whether you're implementing the right duties, the right obligations in terms of the compliance.
So that's, again, to some extent, was the issue I wanted to address with my next question. So the importance of this qualification. So could we summarize that the importance is, or the ideal probably solution would be to have to qualify the relationship in the same way as it will be subsequently qualified by the regulator?
Not necessarily. Actually, it can be different understanding and different qualifications done by the institution itself and by the regulator. Of course, the right answer is to properly and accurately qualify it, but the qualification might differ. And especially we had actually experience a year ago when our position and regulators' position was sort of at the very beginning different in terms of relationship between two financial institutions. But after quite detailed discussions and few exchange of the legal arguments between the financial institution and the regulator, we came up to the third sort of conclusion what it could be, the type of relations, and of course what could be then as a result the duties on both sides. I mean on the one financial institution supervised by the Bank of Lithuania and on the other financial institution supervised by another regulator. So sometimes the initial qualification might be sort of not accurate or might change once the product develops. So that's also could be and that's why initial sort of discussions with the regulator might end up later on a different type of relations. So it's very dynamic. You have to follow what you planned initially and how the product develops. You need to double check once again whether some changes in the terms and conditions of in the contract with a third party had made some kind of impact to your legal qualification, again, just to verify.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Now let's turn to Gita, and we have heard the word outsourcing for quite a number of times today. Could you please describe a little bit what is an outsourcing relationship and how does it correlate with the responsibility to have internal control in the institution?
Hi. Well, actually, there are two questions here, but they are very connected together. So, briefly, outsourcing is, doing things you could do internally, but not doing them internally, but hiring someone else to do that because you believe that they are better at it. When we talk about internal control and outsourcing, we know that every institution has the responsibility to have proper internal control functions and procedures, and of course outsourcing is a big part of that. So you all probably know the very complicated rules of Bank of Lithuania and EBA regarding outsourcing, and I know that all of you who have read them said that, oh my God, what this is very complicated and I don't know what to do with that. But basically, what they did is they said, you have to put your outsourcing agreements as part of your internal control procedures, and we will help you do that. Just follow our rules. Now, if I may, I will elaborate a little bit more into that. So when we look at the internal control, we have a few most important elements. It is structure, division of duties and responsibilities. We have information systems, we have control systems, and we have procedures to fix problems that we identify. So when it comes to outsourcing, imagine that you're building your company, you're building the organizational structure, and you're deciding who will do what and what will be needed in order for me to provide the services. So for example, I may decide that I will do accounting internally, or I may decide that I will ask someone else to do accounting for me. It doesn't matter which way I go, still I have to think about things like, how important is this? Can I still provide my services if this goes wrong? Will I be still compliant with legal requirements if this goes wrong? Who will report the information I need? And who will be in charge of the information I need? So it doesn't matter if you have a CFO and a team doing the accounting, or you have a CFO and a third-party provider doing the accounting. Still, you assess how risky is the function, how important is the function. So is it outsourcing or is it internal? Still, you would do the same thing. Now, when you have already decided that, it doesn't matter if you choose your people inside the organization or if you're choosing the service provider, you will do a due diligence. So the laws also said you have to do the due diligence, but again, you would do it anyway if you would be choosing the people. Third, if you have someone in your team, you will tell them, okay, you have to report to the CFO, and the CFO has to report to the board, etc. So when it comes to service providers, it's the same rules. You have to have agreements that are clear about what information the service provider will bring to the CFO and others in the company. And last but not least, you have to have control. So if you have this team in your company, it's easier for the compliance officer and for the internal auditor to go to them and to inspect them and to say to them, okay, this and this is not okay, fix it. But again, if you outsource that, the same things should apply. You would still need in your agreement rights for you, for your auditors, to come to them and to do the same inspections you would do if they would be internally, and then to have mechanisms how they would make things better if your internal auditor or someone else in your compliance team says that it's not okay, they're not doing this correctly. So when it comes to outsourcing and internal control, yes, there are very detailed rules that we think are very complicated, but if we just put that service provider into our organization as one of our own, we see that this all makes sense, and you would have to do it anyway. Just a little bit more negotiations are needed because, well, they're not sitting in your building.
Thank you. And could you elaborate a little bit on the extent, to what extent financial institutions can outsource the functions? And probably a related topic would be, can you really outsource the liability? What happens with the liability of the institution when the function is being outsourced to a third party?
No, that's a very good question. We actually do get that question a lot. The thing is, and the most important rule is that you can't outsource your responsibilities and your liabilities. So it's pretty clearly stated that, for example, you can't outsource the functions of the board and the supervisory board, as they are the ones in charge, that the company would be compliant with the rules and would provide its service properly. So sometimes the companies think that, okay, maybe I can't find the right people to do that, or I don't think that we have the know-how needed to do that. It will be easier for me just to hire a person who knows these things. And now it's their problem to do it in the correct way. And it's not my problem anymore because they're in charge of the task. And this is wrong because you're still in charge of the task. Now it's just more difficult for you to control how it's being done, And that's why we have these long agreements where they said that they should provide you information, you should go there, you should check them, you should like Google them once a year and see if they are still, they don't have any reputational risk, etc. So it's not easier just to outsource something. It's still your headache, because if something goes wrong, you're liable. And even if you did nothing wrong, the company did something wrong, well, okay, you have the possibility to go and claim damages from them, but still that will be a separate case between you and them. But in the eyes of the regulator, in the eyes of the client, it will be still your liability.
And probably the same applies to reputational risks and reputational liabilities. That would be still on your shoulders.
Of course. And that's why the due diligence of your service providers is so important before you choose one, and then ongoing, of course, to do that regularly as well.
Thank you. Since we have a prominent AML expert on the panel, maybe we will ask Neringa a few questions about outsourcing in the context of AML. We know that lots of institutions probably use third parties in the process of complying with the AML requirements as technical service providers, for example, in the context of customers onboarding or monitoring. Could you please share some insights from the AML perspective? And what are the common mistakes the financial institutions do in that?
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope the sound is okay. So it is a very sort of, loaded question here, and most definitely in the ML area, it is probably one of those areas where outsource is in particular very common. It wasn't the case, say, a decade ago, when fintech sector was not so big and prominent. So basically, like we had the case of, regular sort of, legacy financial institutions, so most commonly banks, basically developing everything internally in-house. And because of the fact that, say, customer identification was most commonly face-to-face, we did not have such a prominent sort of, and complex scenario of outsourcing. So the current situation is obviously, a complete reverse. Whenever we have, technical sort of implementation of requirements, say remote identification, PEP sanction adverse media screening, further sort of actions for customer onboarding, customer monitoring, and even additional sort of elements such as automated risk scoring and whatnot. So basically, when we look at the entire spectrum, all of those technical services can be outsourced. So the practical situation that we see is that more often than not, they are being outsourced by new emerging sort of growing fintech companies. And this is very natural because most of the time it's just sort of cost-wise is just more rational than to develop something internally. And now, going to sort of practical mistakes that we see being made in these particular cases. So I would say that some can be very broad and grave. I'll give several examples of those, and some can be minor, but still can have quite a significant impact for eventual sort of compliance with regulatory requirements. So if we look at those sort of broad, mistakes, like really sort of, grave mistakes, let's start with this example of, sometimes new financial institutions simply believing that, hiring, a technical service provider, contracting, an outsource partner, somehow guarantees the full implementation of the entire function. So in a sense, a turnkey solution. So let's say, like there is still, quite worriedly, a common mistake especially for new market entrants, to believe that, if they provide, let's say, a monitoring, if they hire a monitoring solution provider, their monitoring function is fully covered. So, and that's definitely not the case. So, you only have a technical solution, which you yourself have to adapt and calibrate and, align with your risk profile and customer portfolio. And eventually you have to have human resources, servicing around this solution. So, technical solution can never fully cover, regulatory requirements. Even, such solutions that are more targeted, let's say customer PEP and sanction screening. So even in these cases, where it seems quite narrow and quite clear what the requirements, regulatory requirements foresee and what you need to do, even those, when outsourced, still require internal resources to handle, the actual alerts. So, so this is probably one of the broadest mistakes that can be made, sort of expecting a turnkey solution and a full compliance with regulatory requirements once contracting an outsourced service provider. Some smaller mistakes can be made due to possibly not knowing the full outline of the requirement. And this can come as a surprise to some, and usually it is being caught actually rather too late when certain deficiencies are detected in customer files and similar. So for instance, let's take an example of onboarding service provider. So onboarding service providers, mainly remote identification service providers. So that's already a narrower scope because, to complete onboarding, one needs to conduct many more steps, including risk assessment, additional documentation for different risk category, client collection, and so on. So basically, when we talk about onboarding service providers and solutions, it is usually touches upon only remote identification service providers, sometimes coupled with screening. So when we look at those examples, and specifically say remote identification service providers, it is also very important to be mindful of regulatory requirements locally. So say, FIU technical instructions. And it is very difficult to expect that, for example, a foreign remote identification service provider, providing any of the allowed identification methods, so be it doc and selfie, be it, video identity establishment, will fully comply with the requirements set by our financial intelligence unit, financial crime investigation service. So, and this is the reality where, the financial market participant, a fintech company, has to fully understand the regulatory setup and then investigate a service provider to actually be sure that all of the requirements are complied with, or if that is not the case, if a service provider cannot guarantee compliance with all the requirements, then they have to make sure that internally we still undertake a certain tasks to make sure that eventual result is compliant. And in this case, it can only mean that additional internal resources are needed to handle the workload and to perform quality assurance and whatnot. And even minor mistakes that we have noticed in our practice can be made in cases where financial market participant does not ensure the full technical understanding and details of the arrangement and of the contractual agreement. So for instance, outsourcing sanction and PEP screening, one has to make sure that the service provider fully complies with all the requirements set for yourself. So let's say sources update. So all the sanction lists are being properly updated, and your SLA, service lease agreement, clearly states that at what sort of periodicity and regularity you have those lists updated. For instance, you have to make sure that you know exactly what is the trigger threshold, to actually alert you, to actually provide you with sanction of alerts, because those, matches with lists can be set, at a different threshold. So for instance, if you have a threshold of 85% matches with the list or 95% with matches of the list, it will yield a completely different set of results. So one has to make sure, depending on your portfolio, say you have no customers, for instance, with Slavic names, coming from Slavic countries. So maybe you do not need a lower threshold for your alerts. But if you do have a wider geography of your customers, you most definitely need to make sure that your threshold is set lower in order to catch any potential triggers. So this is something that we noticed in our practice, where most common mistakes are made, not making sure that you yourself understand fully the requirements and your expected technical arrangements, be it internally, in-house or externally. And only then you go to your service provider and you try to understand, okay, so what do they offer? Can it cover, all the requirements, or what part of the requirements can it cover? And then only, sort of set it up and arrange procedurally so that you internally ensure that, the requirements are complied fully.
But that's correct, Neringa, if we're talking about outsourcing relations. But what we have seen, not once, that typically by default, some of the third parties like partner is considered as being outsourced service provider, and we're starting analysis on exactly things and topics that you just elaborated and mentioned. But at the end of the day, we discover that it's totally not outsourcing, or maybe it's like agency model, which means completely different requirements coming from ML and from general compliance arrive. And more importantly, if the relations could be structured in the corresponding banking relations, again, this qualification change completely the duties and obligations on your side as financial institution, sort of acquiring the service, and the same duties and obligations on that your partner, counterparty of the agreement. So I guess this is also important to mention that, for instance, if the third party, the partner, is qualified as outsourced service provider, so it must be definitely understood, first of all, what you're buying. Like, like a golden rule, don't sign what you don't understand. So that should be one of, I guess, main takeaways, just to especially in AML field, to especially understand what you are buying. But again, before that, you have to understand whether you're buying outsourced outsourced services, or maybe you're entering into cooperation agreement, as we call it, which is based on corresponding relations, which means that your partner's clients and you for your partner, you are just like in mutually bilingual relations without going or exposing into one's customer's base, which again might result in different requirements. And if we are talking about the agency or distributors model, so definitely you can agree what you want, but if you are the principal, so you would take all the responsibilities, duties from all the regulatory fields, because you would be the one who is onboarding the clients, who is responsible for due KYC, AML checks, monitoring, and so on, the full sort of cycle of the steps from AML, and of course from other fields as well, but talking about AML. So that also, it's very important. Just it illustrates how the qualification at the early stage is important, because maybe if it's corresponding relations, So you don't need to go in such a details as you just described in case of outsourcing. Meanwhile, if you're like vice versa, if you're sort of believe that this is corresponding but appears into outsourcing, so you open the book of long list of things to do before you sign. And of course, it takes time. And what is also important that in certain cases, which is significant functions that are outsourced, again, the question is very interesting. What could be, defined as significant and not significant services? Approval must be received before you sign the agreement. And it also takes time and might take not 1 month or even more if it's more complex relations. So that's, again, at the one hand, it seems that it's very sort of formal and theoretical thing, but in reality, it's totally opposite. It's very dynamic, it's very live, and it's very important in all sort of operational stages of the financial institution.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I completely agree, because this sort of preliminary, qualification of the relationship is key. But what you also referenced is, understanding that this relationship can change and might change in time is also very important, because where we saw some more complex mistakes being made in practice is then, for instance, company has a quite clearly established model, initial qualification, and, this is the model with, with this third party somehow qualified, and we have all the sort of internal controls constructed around this. But then, something changes during time, but the model and the controls, they don't change. Somehow just we roll with this same setup. And then what happens is that you basically have a very serious violation of regulatory requirements, because if factual situation changed, and you haven't changed your supervisory model, internal model, then you are in breach of regulatory requirements. So those examples we've seen, from very sort of, very easy ones, like, not requalifying relationships due to Brexit. So for instance, it came out as a surprise for some, that, for instance, agency and distribution relationships, they are only existent in Europe, in EU member states. And, in preparation for Brexit, not many thought about, some UK agents that they had, that, now we have to think about something different, about a different type of, model that could be a workable solution, because agency or distribution would no longer be. So those are probably a lighter and easier mistakes. But more complex mistakes, where you need to sort of requalify your product and your further relationship with the customer. For instance, you for a long time you were sort of imagining that this is outsourced, but then apparently it has to be qualified as something else, and you cannot outsource a certain function, or you cannot procure it from that sort of entity. So this is something that it always goes back to a very clear set of factual circumstances and conditions, clearly understanding your own function, what you have to do, no matter how you do it. And then, only then going back to this drawing board and clearly putting legal requirements and your factual situation against one another, and deciding, okay, so this is the model that we have to have in place, and these are the controls that we have to implement if things change. So absolutely.
Thank you, Neringa. Amazing. So Gita, maybe just let's try together to summarize briefly what we have heard about outsourcing. So what would be the kind of main message to the client, to a financial institution, which is considering an outsourcing agreement, considering outsourcing some function?
My first advice would be to ask, is it really worth it to give away something to a third party if you could do it internally? In the first part, Yulia and her panel were discussing the freelance model and how it is important for everyone to collaborate, to work together, how important it is for information to flow in the organization in order so everyone would be in line and the risk would be minimized. So imagine how it is more difficult to have this if you outsource something. So first, I would say that outsourcing is only for things that you truly don't want and can't have internally. The second thing is to really understand what you're outsourcing and to evaluate what will happen if something goes wrong. Because if something can go wrong, it will probably go wrong. So just think about that and then try to have in mind procedures and those safety measures in your agreements and in your relationships so you could minimize or even prevent those things from happening.
Thank you, Gita. Could I return back to Neringa? And Neringa, could we elaborate a bit on correspondent banking relationship in the context of AML? That is, I believe, also a very relevant and interesting topic to touch upon.
Yeah, definitely, especially because, the only sort of regulatory source, if we talk about, national regulation, where correspondent relationship is sort of referenced and mentioned, is the AML law, surprisingly. So, we only have the definition of correspondent relationship in the AML law, but this is not coincidental. Because, the way the correspondent relationship has developed, and the concept has developed, and just relationships have developed, it have been more or less, on the sort of contractual side between two financial institutions. But more than that, from sort of the control side and from the mutual understanding side, it used to be sort of in this space and area of, gentleman understanding, gentleman agreement. So basically, correspondent relationships have developed as obviously, for business needs to initiate, transactions quicker, to service your clients better, and to have, your own needs satisfied, such as treasury or FX or conversion and whatnot. But initially, the sort of entire control setup was more or less based on this mutual understanding. What do I need from you? What can you offer? And how can I minimize your risk by, say, agreeing to limit certain types of transactions or limit transactions for certain customers and alike. So the sort of formal inclusion of correspondent relationship definition in AML directive and AML law is very indicative of the fact that, there is a very sort of high expectation and very clear understanding that ML controls have to surround correspondent relationship. So that's probably one of the sort of simple and preliminary messages. Moving further, obviously, when we talk about correspondent relationship and the current sort of situation with correspondent relationship, and especially when it comes to fintech sector, I believe, there is no organization, no new market participant that hasn't experienced difficulties in sort of, forming correspondent relationships, and that hasn't, been denied opportunity to enter into correspondent relationship. And this is not obviously a new situation. It has been like this or developing along those lines for the past, say, 5 years or even a little bit more, where correspondents have become aware, especially of this increased risk from new market participants, but not due to the fact that these are new market participants and, and they just sort of starting the business, they are forming their customer portfolios, but because of the fact that, they themselves have been tasked with additional controls, meaning that, because they need to understand their partner, they need to understand the type of customers the partner engages with, they need to understand the type of transactions they will be processing on behalf of the partner. What was realized is that in many cases, the controls in correspondent service providers, so, bigger, say, commercial banks or even global banks, were not sufficient. So that was sort of one of the key, circumstances around this, why the correspondent relationship network has shrinked and quite substantially. So now what is very important to bear in mind is that in order to be able to provide correspondent service or to receive correspondent service, probably ML controls is one of those areas which is the most important to tackle properly in order to get that. So basically, in order to be accepted by a correspondent, one needs to show proper ML controls, working operational order of ML controls, sufficient staff, sufficient technical resources, and obviously, a very clear risk appetite that is being abided by within the institution. And on the other hand, when we talk about, a financial institution sort of offering correspondent service, they also have to have very sort of clearly defined and clear internal controls in order to monitor their respondents properly, which means that, they need to have very specific transaction monitoring system sort of, created around this correspondent service so that they can detect any irregularities happening through their sort of, banking accounts. So this is something that obviously in this day and time has become a very valuable service, quite difficult to get, and very appreciated once gotten. And in that case, all the controls have to be in place from both ends to make sure that this service does not increase the level of risk for both institutions.
Thank you. Another type of relationship which may occur would be agency. Gita, maybe you could briefly describe what is that?
So agents are used to provide money, payment services. And the problem with agency is that sometimes institutions find a partner, find someone who will assist them in providing payment services, and they say they don't really dig into what this means. And the problem here is that, well, if the person that is helping you to provide payment services is truly an agent, well, then this person should register with the Bank of Lithuania if the services is provided here. And for example, if you're passporting your services, then Bank of Lithuania should also be notified that this person will be used to provide services in other jurisdictions. And if you don't follow these rules, then of course you can get a penalty, you can get a red card from the Bank of Lithuania, and of course you don't want to do that. So that is important to have in mind.
Okay, and Neringa, in terms of AML compliance, what about agency? Are there any specific rules or considerations to be taken into account?
So yeah, definitely. I suppose AML sort of, it takes all the balls, in terms of control here as well, in the sense that, this is no news, and this have been in our local regulation for nearly 2 years now. But in the beginning of 2020, when the Bank of Lithuania released their ML instructions for market participants, sort of updated, renewed instructions, they specifically included a separate section on agent controls from the ML perspective as well. So meaning that it's not new. It's not that this agent control from the AML perspective is only expected since 2020, but it has been specifically highlighted that this is what is being specifically expected in terms of agent control from the AML area. So then when it comes to agency relationship or distribution relationship, but agencies sort of having it, wider and more complex. what is very important to understand is how controls are being structured on both ends. Where somehow, this is also nothing new. This is not a shocking discovery, but we still see this as quite a common mistake, that some principals, some financial institutions that have agents and distributors still somehow make a distinction between customers that they onboard directly and that they onboard through agents or distributors. And here it is very important to understand that any customer through that comes through any channel is still ultimately a customer of a principal or a financial institution with a license. So having said that, it is very important how the financial institution, performs the oversight of their agent and distributors, how they make sure that, agents, if they have, for instance, different onboarding systems or different remote identification systems, separate from the principal, how they make them compliant with principal's requirements, how they make them compliant with what principal wants to see in terms of customer due diligence. So in this particular case, it is essential to know exactly how the agent operates, what sort of controls it has put in place, and also to make sure that the principal has communicated very clearly, be it through procedural documentation sharing or being through, very formal requirements to apply certain procedures, what is compliant and not, has performed, proper trainings of agents and distributors so that, agents and distributors and their employees, know exactly what they need to do and what they're doing on behalf of the principal. So from the ML side, a set of separate requirements is definitely there, but the overall practical implementation is even wider, is even more complex. So, and this is definitely, again, on the shoulders of the principal to prove, say, to the supervisor, should one come to check their compliance, that they performed everything, correctly, because ultimately they are responsible for, for compliant, provision of services and for compliant onboarding and monitoring of customers. So, it doesn't really matter if they do it through the agent. It's just an extension of their service, so to say. So this is very important that all the controls are adequate and put in place.
Thank you. Thank you, Neringa. So I think it's time now to try to wrap up, and maybe a few final takeaways for our audience. Eva?
So yes, of course, I believe from, in general, what we discuss here, so the first task and the first thing what each applicant, specifically I'm stressing applicant, must do before starting building all the business model, to understand on which particular relationship with the third parties the business model is will be structured. So again, if it is some third parties used for internal functions to cover, that's totally different story. But if we are talking about the products and services which should generate income in the future, get with a received license, so each applicant, first of all, must very accurately qualify the relations, because that might result totally different financial results, totally different package of the duties and responsibilities, totally different setup, or totally different actually type of infrastructure the one should use. So my strong recommendation is never skip this. I know that it sounds very formal, very like legal advice, but this is crucial for business actually.
Thank you, Eva. Gita?
Well, my advice would be to look at the requirements that are for outsourcing not as a burden, not as just a formality, but as guidelines for you to manage your risks and to make your internal processes better so that you could prevent the risks, or at least to mitigate the risks and to have a better business and a more successful business.
Neringa?
I would say probably the key takeaway is that each type of relationship warrants a different set of controls. So one needs to be aware of that, and especially from the ML side. So there is no one size fits all in this. So it's very important to sort of look case by case and individualize and customize, and only then you can be sure that you will reach full compliance with the requirements.
So thank you very much, our experts, Yeva, Gita, Neringa. I hope that was at least to some extent useful and interesting. And of course, whoever has any questions, any requests for further elaboration, our details are displayed and always welcome. Thank you.
And our last presentation today would be about information security, because what we have not to forget, but fintech is fin and tech, meaning that technologies takes major importance in the activities of a business. So Renatas, stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So as the last presenter for today, I have the honor to close our event with one of the most important topics, if not the most important topic in fintech sector, namely ICT and data security. So digitalization has increased dramatically due to COVID-19 and has not gone unnoticed. The EU institutions have been scrambling to keep up with potential risks involved. The Parliament and the Council are working on new Digital Operational Resilience Act, DORA, which has the monumental task to harmonize and set a general standard for ICT risk management in the whole financial sector. The ECB continues to work diligently on the Digital Euro project, but also it notes in its strategy review that digitalization and its impact to the monetary policy shall be closely monitored. The EBA has taken a more direct approach. It has adopted the European Supervisory Examination Program, ESEP, for 2022. In it, ICT risk management directly and indirectly is covered in 2 out of 5 topics. Moreover, the institution has taken upon itself to expand the approach to operational interdependencies and of digital platforms and the service providers that operate therein. The ESMA also is trying to keep up. In its annual work program for 2022, it promises to focus on digital operational resilience as DORA is on the horizon. So these are just a few examples that should be taken into consideration. And with this general framework in mind, we should consider the steps that we could take today or possibly in the near future to ensure compliance with current ICT risk management trends to prepare for an easier transition to the near future. So, as one of the panelists today noted that one of the great things for compliance to have is an insight to the future, so we will try to just see the potential risks and potential issues that should be covered in the near future. So, first of all, the new challenge will be to resolve or find workarounds to intrinsic or currently unresolved issues. Some fintechs need to find the answer between how much tech and fin should there be in their business. So some of them focus more on the financial aspect of the business rather than tech. This is a valid approach provided that outsourcing arrangements or any other arrangements would take care of the technological advance. However, those neglecting tech and taking more and lacking more developed systems will still have to properly manage their ICT risks by trying to manage legacy systems and or operational risks due to possible human error. Another question that should be, well, answered or should be considered is the object of your internal control. Basically, the risk management should have a clear defined object in order to be efficient. So clearly describing the systems of the company and the functions of the systems is extremely important, and thus proper documentation is also vital. Basically, the whole idea is that properly functioning system is not a proper substitute to your risk management, meaning that even with a properly functioning system, without proper documentation, you would show that the whole idea is that the risk management system would not work as it would just have would not have a clear understanding of what it is trying to do. So the lack of proper documentation would show that the internal controls of the company cannot function properly, even though the systems would be running fine. Also, the third question to be considered is that when talking about internal control, as it was previously discussed, it is a given that it should be organized in the three-line model. However, what should be taken into consideration is the personnel arrangement in there. So such arrangements or such structures where the ICO is in the second line, however, he is the best or head programmer, it's flawed, meaning that the ICO's function in the three-line model is to implement control rather than be a good coder or team leader. They should be knowledgeable in security requirements and best market practices and standards, etc. They should be the second set of eyes that oversees your system, not the one that plans it or sees it for the future. The first set should be most definitely be the CTO, the chief architect of your systems, provided your system is developed in-house. So the second challenge, even though it's not new and it is ongoing, would be outsourcing arrangements and ICT outsourcing. Due to changes in outsourcing legislation, as you all are aware, contracts should be renewed till the end of the year. However, in addition to compliance with the outsourcing regulations, also you should consider and hopefully took into consideration ICT risk management, namely stipulated minimum cybersecurity requirements, specification of your company's data lifecycle, etc. Of course, it should have been done or should be done in proportion to the services outsourced, even though the services may not be technical in nature. Also, although the topic of outsourcing in general was covered more in depth in previous and panels and presentations, I would like to stress that when outsourcing services, you do not outsource your ICT risks and will remain liable for the control operations of your company. Supervision of your service provider should be done in accordance to outsourcing regulations. However, in addition to them, you should bear in mind that when outsourcing services with ICT risks, your company would not be exempt to information security reviews, testing obligations, information security training and awareness. So proper arrangements should be made for this as well. A new feature to be considered in the near future is platforms and operating in cooperation with other service providers. So as discussed in the previous panel, there are types of arrangements that fall between the cracks of outsourcing, agency, and other types of arrangements. So the whole point here is just the EBA took the approach to note that even though the partners do not form outsourcing arrangements or agency arrangements, their interconnectedness forms a new type of risk and also create new additional risks that should be managed properly. So just imagine that the scope of your ICT risk management should be clearly defined and operating on the same digital platform with other service providers integrates your cooperation model, and they enter into your ICT software and system perimeter, and they form a link with your systems. Just bear in mind that a chain is as strong as its weakest link, so therefore the partners should not pose any additional risks to you, or the risks associated to them should be evaluated. So, as previously noted, in this regard, the scope is, of course, defining the scope of your internal systems and their functionality is extremely important, and I would go as far as to say that they should include the interoperability with your systems and the systems of the partners operating on the same platforms. Also, of course, the whole idea would be mapping these interdependencies and analyzing possible risks attached. In addition to ICT risk management, of course, there should be consideration regarding the data security and, well, GDPR regulations. So data control and ownership questions should be considered even though they're partially out of scope of the ICT risk management. So, lastly, there's another topic that should be explored, namely the DORA regulation. Currently, it should be under review by the Commission and it should be passed to the European Parliament. Possibly the document should see the light of day in 2022, possibly the first half. So when the document will come into force, service providers will be left with 12 months to, well, a 12 months window to ensure compliance. This document builds upon EBA guidelines of ICT risk management and outsourcing arrangements. However, it also adds some extra oversight and extra requirements that have caused some of critique and possible discontent with service providers. So those of you who are aware of the ABA guidelines would be aware of the exit strategies and some of the requirements regarding oversight of third-party ICT service providers. But the regulation will also bring, although not explicitly, but possibly data localization requirements, since it is implied that between the lines, you can understand that the competent authorities will not be able to implement their supervision powers outside of the EEA territory. So it is implied that possibly the data localization is incoming. However, this is, well, cause of many debates and, well, we will see what the document will contain, what the final version, what will contain. So, key takeaways. I would say that 2022 will be a turning point for ICT and data security management. It is a topic that is being discussed and possibly will contain many new regulations. What could be done at this point to prepare? Possibly, and well, I would suggest to have clear documentation, which would support the systems and leave flexibility for further development. So another thing is that you should consider that the ICT risk management will be relevant not only to you, but also to the partners you cooperate with. So, many thanks.
So thank you, Renata. And thank you all for joining us today. And next week, we will talk about internal audit, its role within the organization, and EML audits. Full program and registration link will be announced soon. So just keep following us up and see you soon. Bye, everyone.